my feelings about. Hey,
Now we're live.
so next week, Bill, I'm going to the OpenStack Summit in Atlanta, and I hope you appreciate how hard it is for me to not say Hotlanta over and over again, because I love a cheesy, stupid thing.
All right.
But it occurred to me as I was still dealing with inbound requests to meet with people, and then looking at my calendar where basically I have maybe 5 minutes free during the whole conference, that I'm terrible at dealing with conferences. Like, am I doing it right that I'm meeting with people nonstop when I go to a conference, Bill? How do you deal with conferences?
I mean, normally I try, well, I don't go to many. Usually I only go to ones where we have something significant to announce that I've participated in. So I hadn't gone for a conference for 2 years um, until this last one where we were announcing Service Engage. And 2 years before that, it was to say, hey, we're into DevOps now. So I just don't go to very many. When I go, I tend to stay focused on the stuff that I'm doing, and then occasionally they ask me to come to customer stuff. So I guess I don't proactively make myself busy. I try to be as unbusy as possible. Usually because I'm so wound up by the time I'm done talking about the thing I've been working on for a year or two, that I just kind of want to walk around
Yeah.
like kind of in a daze, have some
Yeah,
drinks.
no, there's this great post I should put in the show notes that it sounds really egotistical, but like it's kind of interesting because it's sort of like how to talk to me after I've given a talk. And I need to find that, but it's good because it's like I remember reading it and thinking like, wow, that's so true, right? Like, and it's like what you were just saying is like after you give a talk at a conference, you're basically like in this weird like whirling dervish state where you're just like, "Wah!" Right? Because unless you're like the most cold-blooded, and I mean this in a good way, sort of cold-blooded, just sort of like professional, maybe like a professor's like this, right, where they lecture every day multiple times. But like it's not a common occurrence, even for people in our situation, like that you talk to someone all the time, and you're just sort of like you've got all your adrenaline and all that stuff, and you're looking to kind of like continue your sort of high, if you will, of talking.
Although I have to say, you were at that Pulse talk I gave, right, in the big MGM Grand Arena, and after
Oh
that,
yeah.
we went to the bar with you, me, James, and Tom. That was fun.
Mm.
That was kind of weird. Normally, I really need to kind of zone out after a talk, but that one.
Yeah, I forgot that was like late in the day, right? The talk that you gave.
The
So
other thing is I was only part of the talk, so I kind of got to sit down for like 20
yeah,
minutes afterwards and kind of mellow out a bit.
yeah. No, I mean, and just to recap that, right? Like, I mean, I think I've been to a lot of IBM conferences, and I think the talks you guys gave at Pulse this year were pretty good because they contained like code and demos.
Mm.
It was great. Like it was nice seeing that. But so you said something when I was initially asking you about conferences that I it's one of those obvious things that I know is obvious and I still struggle with doing. And you said like you just go to things that like you're focused on or that are in your area. And I think that's my problem, Bill. Is like I need to like focus more and like figure out this thing is in my area and therefore I go to that. But like I mean, don't you find it hard to like not go to other things and get involved in other stuff, or like do you compartmentalize topics easily?
I think it's more just because I'm introverted. Like, I really like hanging out with my family, and I
Mm.
really like hanging out with my team, and that's pretty much good for me. So the
Yeah.
conference is more of a, okay, we did something, and now we, need to talk about it, and then I go to the conference. But if
Yeah.
it's go to a conference for fun, I'll almost never do it.
Well, before we follow the logical conclusion one would make, which is incorrect about family and friends versus scheduling too many meetings when it comes to me. We'll switch topics really quickly because that's a
Right.
so another thing. So I was at DevOps Days Austin earlier this week, which is a great conference. Like I can't recommend that conference enough. I mean, especially the Austin one, of course, because I'm always a big champion of that. But DevOps Days in general, and I gave the second day keynote, which I'll put a recording for it in the show notes here. But other than going over some data we have about tools usage and maturity of DevOps, like what I've been trying to do with this talk when I give it is sort of explain like how the nerd people can talk to the suit people, if you will, and like how you can kind of like understand the language that they have and speak to them. And it was interesting, like it seemed like it was highly coordinated, but Andrew Schaefer, who's been in the DevOps and sort of agile infrastructure community forever, he gave the first day's keynote, and he had a similar series of slides of like the way he did it. It's always interesting to see how people make points in slides. Is he had one slide that was kind of like the equivalent of a tag cloud of like a bunch of tech words, and he's like raise your hand if you know all these words, and like most everyone raised their hand. And then he had another one. The next slide was like a tag cloud of business words, like Abita or however you pronounce that, and like Opinc and all this stuff that was sort of like business stuff. And like he asked the same question. There was a fair amount of people who raised their hands, but it was an interesting like visual way of saying like, hey, as you increasingly like are doing IT nowadays, right? Like unless you're sort of relegated to the more Lockean realm, like you've got to talk to business people more, and like you should learn how to do that, right? Like they've got a whole different way of interacting and communicating with each other. And I was thinking like, since you work at a company that has the word business in its name, like you must have lots of experience figuring out like as you sort of like climb the ranks over the year, kind of talking to the business side and wangling out how I don't know, maybe it's no different at all, but how it's different talking in like your team retrospective or planning meeting versus going to sort of like a slide-driven meeting with people who like are wearing Oxford shirts and such.
Yeah, well, actually, I think I speak a fair bit of business to both the technical and the business people, because like my role on the technical team is more of a, like in Scrum terms, a product owner at this point. Like I still write a fair bit of code, but oftentimes I'm just kind of talking to the teams like we talked about last time about the goals and the constraints of the thing that we're working on. And I find that if you can't clearly articulate the business reason for why you're doing what you're doing in simple terms, you don't know what you're doing. And you need to figure out what you're doing. So I tend to speak pretty much the same way to both the business and the technical people about the business stuff. But I guess the key thing is to be kind of jargon-free and just speaking in really simple, understandable terms of why something is useful or valuable.
Yeah, yeah. No, and I think I was having this conversation with one of my 451 colleagues the other day. Like I saw I was at the Open Compute Project symposium they had down in San Antonio, and Cameron Haight, who works for Gartner, he came and gave a talk on DevOps, and I was like, oh man, that was a really good like general overview, because one of the problems that I always have is I always want to have the intermediate at least level talk. Like right. I don't want to cover like all the basics, if you will, because and I don't mean this in a bad way about like Cameron's presentation at all. Like it's a problem that I have. Like I get really bored by talking about the basics. Like it's sort of like I'll talk about it once and then I think I'm done with it. Like I don't want to talk about it again.
No, that's an interesting thing, because once you become expert in some domain, it really becomes boring to talk about the fundamentals. But whenever you're talking to a new audience, you have to start with those, even though it just seems obvious to you.
Yeah, yeah, no, and I think looking at myself over the years and also other people who like try to go from a technical position, not talking technically, if you will, to like businessy. Like I think that's one of the fundamental things, is making sure like you have to cover the basics, right? And it's not only, as in addition to what you're saying, being clear about the reasons you're doing something, right, and simplifying it, but also making sure you cover like the basics of it, because you often find yourself in this position of like, oh, you just spoke for 5 minutes. And now I need you to start like 30 minutes before that, right? Like I need you to cover everything that led up to this small conclusion that you had for a while.
Yeah. So how was the DevOps conference? How did your keynote go?
I think it was nice, actually. Like it was like a 30-minute talk, and I need to go back and watch it. And I don't know, judging from like people who came up to me through the day to thank me for it, like it was great. It was good. It was nice, and I managed to come up with enough jokes to make people laugh, which is the only reason I do public speaking.
I remember 2 years ago you talked about the Dell Crowbar thing. Is that what it was called?
Oh yeah. That's right. That was another DevOps Days Austin thing 2 years ago. Yeah, it was. I did a little presentation of how the Crowbar team did something inside of a giant company.
Right. What did you talk about this year?
This year, so like we just did we finished up a study about DevOps. Like we surveyed 200 people that we like filtered to be mainstream DevOps people, or people who should be doing DevOps. So for example, we didn't really talk with anyone in technology companies, right? And we just asked them a bunch of questions about what they were doing in DevOps, where they deploy things, tools they use, just trying to get a sense of like what the mainstream DevOps or DevOps-minded market looks like. It's sort of the it's nice that Netflix does that, but how about everyone else? And outside of the tech world, like how are people applying, thinking about, or not applying DevOps stuff? And so a lot of it was going over the first part of it to the point of like trying to do business talk, or teach my fellow nerds how to do business talk, was going over like, so why do you care about like market sizing, and what is market sizing for cloud stuff, and what are like macro drivers and the reasons that you're doing this, what's the environment that allows you to do all this fun like tech stuff. And then once you paint that picture that there's actually like pull for it and interest, like the next step is essentially like, so then we wanted to find out like what the maturity of the DevOps market is. So here's just some standard analyst survey stuff that tells you what that usage is. Like if you remember, like back in the 2000s, there would be surveys all the time about like what's the maturity of using like JBoss versus WebSphere or MySQL versus that. And I mean, it's a different context, but just getting a sense of what DevOps looks like based on what tools people are using.
And what's the goal to sort of figure out where the market is in terms of demand, like where you at in adoption?
Absolutely. Yeah. And I mean, to be completely transparent, right? So the study that we did it as a marketing study with 3 vendors. 3 startups actually, and that was their goal, is to understand like, so we want to sell into like mainstream DevOps, give us some information in addition to everything that we already know, right? Like give us some intelligence about what's going on there. A lot of the stuff that I don't go over in the presentation is all about buying behavior and purchasing triggers and who's deciding it and value propositions, all of that stuff that you would need for basically product marketing to help you figure out how to sell into DevOps, if you will. But as the thing that I talk about more publicly is sort of what I would call a baselining of DevOps, like what the maturity is. And to give you an example of that, right? So one of the questions that we have is basically like, so when you're in development, what do you use to specify how things should be deployed in production, right? Like how do you architect out what things are going to look like in production? And like a lot of our questions, a lot of this is sort of testing out what I would call the utopic DevOps toolchain, or a DevOps series, right? So that question is around, in one idea of the utopic DevOps toolchain, you're using like Puppet and Chef or whatever, Ansible and Salt and all these things in development to specify what things should look like, and it's pretty much the same as it is in production, right? Like, to use an even fresher thing, you might say, in development, we use Docker to make images that then are basically, just cloned and moved into production with very little change, right? But we're using the same tool. So we had a question that was a much more condensed version of all of that. And it turns out that like only 16% of people use like Puppet, Chef, Ansible, or Salt or something like that in development. And the rest use like homegrown tools or golden images or like installers, like, so there's not a lot of use in the mainstream DevOps market of that stuff, if you will, which is kind of interesting. And
yeah, I think a lot of it has to do with sort of the complexity of the environment you're running in. Like with our little Node.js app, we started with a container-based approach, but it just ended up being overkill. So now we just run everything natively on our Mac, like CouchDB and Node.js, and that works just fine. I mean, it's slightly different than production, but it doesn't matter. Whereas, you know Rafe Coburn from Etsy? Yeah, so he works at Etsy on their analytics stuff, and analytics is fairly complicated technology, and so I think their day one experience is basically get a pre-configured VM and basically SSHing over to it because it's all pre-configured with the various backends and data sets that they use for their dev and test.
Right. And do you guys do that, or did I understand right that you don't do that anymore?
No, we started off by doing it with Vagrant, but what we realized was that everybody was sort of naturally just sliding towards native installs on the Mac because the Node and Couch environment was simple enough. I mean, we use Cloudin for our production backend, the company we just bought, but we just use sort of the vanilla Couch API, so it's fine just to use the Apache local version of Couch.
No, we should talk about that some more, because that's like, I think I've makes me sound kind of like an idiot, but when I finally sat down and took a tutorial on Docker instead of just reading all the hype around it, I think I finally understand like why people are so like enamored of it. And the first rung of it is a lot of what you were describing that you started off doing with Vagrant and then you don't do anymore, in the sense of, you can set up an image that's sort of like, here's your, how I was characterizing. I was talking with, so when I was at Dell, I worked on Project Sputnik, which is sort of like the Ubuntu developer laptop we had, and we were always trying to figure out um, how to do like what the Pivotal Workstation stuff did, right? That like you would automate setting up your build environment as quickly as possible, so that you didn't have the wiki page, right? I mean, that's kind of the state of the art. Like you're a new developer on a team. Here's a wiki. I'll see you in 3 days.
Right.
Right? And you just set everything up and get all your keys and like get your source and build it, and you set the directory up this way and everything's magical, and then you finally get to that point where like you can write a line of code and build it and test it and boom, you're done, right? And
Yeah.
you can generate the artifact, like the official
Yeah.
build, and then check it in. And it's funny, like well, I could go all sorts of directions with that. But what we wanted to do was like, how can we speed up some of that? And that's what the Pivotal Workstation thing was. And there's like a little company called Bowery that like, there's a bunch of virtual lab people who do a lot of this stuff and just setting it up. And it seems like one thing that you could use containers for and Docker for and Vagrant for and all this stuff is you could have like, so you want to write a like you want to write a plugin for something, right?
Mm-hmm.
And the first thing that you do to write a plugin for some platform you're writing on is you go get the SDK and you learn how to set it up properly.
Mm-hmm.
Or it seems like you could just get an image, right? Like here's the complete virtual appliance of like as if I set up a desktop for you of working on a plugin. And that's just like one example of like what it seems like, obviously the Docker people, what like in container people want to do. And then you sort of extend that over to be like to the virtual appliance idea of like instead of giving you like a MySQL database, like that's just a thing that you've got to download and install and do all the package management for and configure, what if I just give you an image and all you have to kind of do is like give it a password or like give it like the minimal thing and then it's up and running and then you're set, right? And
Right.
and if you basically pull the pull the operating system into part of the middleware, I don't know, that seems really interesting. like again, that's what the virtual appliance people Bitnami's still around, but there was another one, RPath, and all these guys were trying to do in the mid 2000s, and it never really panned out. I'm not quite sure why, but it seems like there's more of the potential to do that with like Docker images and containers. But
We actually use for that same system, so we use Max and just natively installed components for local development, but we actually use Docker as part of our build system because it allows for pretty highly parallelizable but isolated builds. So like we've got 5-6 developers on the team, and
yeah,
with Docker we can all run builds at the same time, and it just nicely isolates them from each other so they don't conflict with each other.
yeah, and then it seems like. And again, like I kind of go over all this stuff so that people can tell me where I'm wrong or crazy or whatever. But like, so it seems like the next logical step you have with containers is basically what you build are a bunch of container images, and then that's what you deploy to production. Like with maybe like a minimal amount of configuring things on top of it. But
Yeah, that's
like
what
I don't.
Netflix does, right? Don't they
Yeah,
basically they end up pooping out a golden image, and that's what they sort of deploy to
yeah,
AWS.
yeah. Yeah. Like it's funny. Like I have this weird blind spot that I probably shouldn't admit in my programming knowledge, where like I exited programming just as virtualization became a really big deal, right? So like I haven't lived through like sorting through how virtualization and images and all of that stuff kind of affects how you do your ALM and everything.
Oh, come on, virtualization became a big deal in 1964 with the mainframe.
Hey, there should be some sort of like reoccurring theme like song we play with that. Like back in my day.
Right.
But yes, yeah, no, so in my mind, like this idea of like allowing developers to build up images, whether you want to call them containers or golden images or whatever, is like this weird taboo, right? Like there's something missing from there. But I think that's like the logical stuff with Docker is I'm putting hyperbole on it, but it's sort of like you Bill are sitting there or someone on your team and you code up the new thing and you're like, boom, now I commit a Docker image and it's just like clone my laptop into production. And like, obviously there's a lot of stuff around that, but it's that seems really interesting.
Yeah, I know when we were proposing the Eclipse Orion project, like the web-based IDE,
Yeah.
Like 5 years ago or something, one of our sort of golden scenarios was that the new developer experience could be sort of just cloning a desktop environment, or sorry, cloning a hosted environment just as simply as you can clone a Git repo. So say we were both developers and I've got a thing that works perfectly. Instead of going through the wiki page, like you said, you could just say, clone Bill's environment, and you'd be at exactly the same spot I was at from day one. Instead of and have it be sort of a more natural thing. Instead of having wiki pages that talks about exactly how it's supposed to work, your starting point is
Right.
how a senior developer is already working, which is probably always going to be better than a wiki page.
Yeah, yeah, yeah. No, I mean definitely like in the development lab environment, it looks like there's a lot to offer there. Like it would be really nice. Yeah, I mean exactly. Like this is, and that's the vision we always had with like the Sputnik profile tool thing is like, wouldn't it be cool if you could sort of like check out how like Bill Higgins does his development, right? Like you would kind of like model what your environment looks like, and you can just effectively clone it or whatever. Which, yeah, to the point of Orion and like CodeEnvy and Cloud9 and all these people who have sort of the potential of like a cloud-based IDE. Like it's a lot easier because you can just kind of clone it over. But when you're dealing with the actual physical workstations, it's not so achievable unless you have a wiki page or something.
Yeah, the other thing though too is that how developers end up being so particular about the editor they use and the conventions that they use. So there's always this tension between conformity across a team and an individual developer doing the things they want. The whole thing about a tab versus four spaces. How much breath has been wasted over the year on that topic.
Exactly. Or like if they're curly braces on the same line as a method declaration or right below it.
Right.
Always very controversial.
That's why it's good to be the most senior guy on the team.
Exactly. So
Four spaces.
so then speaking of being the senior guy, so one of the things that you sent over ahead of time to talk about, like we're that is one thing I think we'll develop as a topic that we have here in our little under development podcast is sort of like what the senior guy wants to tell the kids, and one of the things you're talking about is like in the realm of process, like trying to get to where you have less process, like the whole less is more thing. So like having less stuff there. Now, I have no idea what that means. So why don't you just kick that off?
Yeah, well, for me, it was kind of an evolution. Like, I didn't really have a whole lot of process till I came to the jazz team, the Rational Jazz team, and Eric Gamma, the design patterns guy, kind of set the process there. He invented JUnit, so test-driven development was kind of just a given on that project, which I wasn't used to. But then over time, I started to be the most senior person on the team, and I started this project Service Engage about maybe 6 months ago, and had a really great team, and we got to create a new app from scratch. And it was kind of interesting to see because I was the most senior developer, both in terms of, my title or whatever, but also just age. So there were a lot of younger developers on the team, and they were very kind of militant about their process rules. So they wanted 100% code coverage, and they wanted mandatory code reviews for any change because their goal was that they wanted a perfect code base, which on some level you can totally get behind. Like, what manager or senior team lead is not going to say, I've got a bunch of developers who are crazy about having perfect code. It's a blessing. But
Right.
it ended up being a pain in the ass because we would end up getting in these situations where the business would say, hey, we've got a conference in 3 days, can you guys get in this one last feature? And the answer was, well, if we follow our strict processes with 100% code coverage and code reviews, the answer is no, because it just takes longer.
Yeah.
But then we'd get in these fights about whether we should do that or not. And so I went up we visited, myself and a guy named Mike O'Rourke, who was like the CTO of IBM Software Group at the time. We went up and visited John Allspot at Etsy in January just to kind of talk about DevOps adoption and stuff like that, because he had to go through his own DevOps adoption at Etsy. And just for fun, I said, what are your rules around code reviews? And he said, we don't have rules around code reviews. And I said, well, what's your rule around test coverage? And he said, we don't have rules around test coverage. And then I kind of extrapolated out and I said, do you have any rules? And the basic answer was we don't have any strict rules, but we've kind of got peer conventions that aren't written down and anyone can decide to go around, but people just tend to do them. So I came back to my team and I said, hey guys, I don't want to have mandatory 100% code coverage anymore. I want you guys to use your judgment on when you need code coverage, and same thing with code reviews. And they actually were really uncomfortable with that because I think they were more comfortable with the strict rules versus I want you to use your judgment based on the context of the situation. And so I guess my view now is that I think John and Etsy really have it right that you hire smart people and you share with them some good practices, but then you say use your judgment and make the call based on the situation. So if it's 3 days before the conference or a competitor's coming out with a feature, skip the code coverage, make up for it later, and sure, you're accumulating technical debt, but there's never a right answer in every context. It always depends on the situation.
Right, right, and this there's a lot to be said about all or followed up on all that. One thing that strikes me is I've been in many situations that there's two situations sort of collaboration management wise here. One is sort of like we have they're not even tops down. It doesn't have to be like it's all like totalitarian, but we have these rules and process that we follow, right? And we might have collectively agreed on them and been comfortable with them. And we just follow the process. And that's how we figure out if we're doing things correctly, right? In addition to other metrics. But like if all the tests are green, then everything's cool, right? So like I have immediate feedback because I'm following process. Or you have the other thing where it's sort of like, well, we're just responsible. Right, and again, these are extreme ends, right? Like we're all adults here, and we know if we're doing well or not, and we know what we should be doing hygienically. Like obviously, I shouldn't check in code that like breaks things, right?
Right.
Sometimes you need to take risks, and so in that context, and whether it's not only in the software world where I've been in situations like this, but also in my non-software world, be an analyst and working on corporate strategy and things like that, and one of the things that it's weird to think this, but I'm always eager to know is like I need like some sort of feedback loop of how I'm doing. You know what I mean? And so I wonder if you and a development team don't have like defined process, like how do people get feedback that they're doing the right thing, like ongoing, right? Because we all work in companies, and like you want to know if like, well, if I'm going to take a risk and go off and do this wackadoodle thing for a while, how do I know that I'm not going to be punished for it? Like, how do I know I'm doing the right thing and course correct? And that's one thing that process is nice for, is it's like, well, if you're following the process, you're safe, essentially. Mm-hmm. But how do you like build feedback into the system if you don't really have strict process so people know how they're doing?
I don't know. It's probably an oversimplification, but I guess have business measures instead of technical measures. So like if you're in the SaaS business, where are people at coming through your funnel? Are you getting more users to the site? Are you getting more users through trials? And obviously it's hard to correlate one developer's lack of unit tests or not with improving the funnel, but I guess those are the types of measures I tend to look at. I mean, I guess another approach is if you've got kind of the two pizza team with a pretty small team, it's hard for somebody to get lost in there. So if you've only got 6 or 8 people on a team, you have pretty good clarity about who's doing what and who's doing good stuff and who's not getting it done.
So this brings up like a thing we were talking about in the first episode or last time we talked or whatever, which is what changes when you go from a development team supporting packaged software to a development team supporting a SaaS. And just to like way over theorize here. So a lot of what you're saying, right? Like, well, we're going to have less process and we only need to buy 2 pizzas and things like that. Like, so if we brought in like a classic, not even the development team, but the support team, the product manager, all the people needed to support like a classic enterprise software thing that was packaged software, right? Like that drives lots of revenue. You're talking hundreds of people, right?
Right.
And at that scale, like you need to order a lot more than 2 pizzas.
Right.
and you probably you're going to need some process for determining which toppings to have on all those pizzas, let alone some process for like coordinating everything, right?
Right. And make sure everybody gets a piece before somebody gets 2 pieces.
Exactly, and like when a bug comes in, you've got to triage it through, 1 through level 3 support, and I mean, like you just need once you have maybe like more than 20 people, you just need process, or bad things will happen. Essentially, is the theory. Um, so it makes me wonder, like, so if you're supporting a SaaS software, if you're supporting a SaaS business, do you sort of implicitly need less people and therefore you don't need as much process? Like, you see where I'm going with this? Like,
Yeah,
and then it seems like it's not a leaky abstraction, but it's a leaky business requirement that, like, because we have a SaaS, that's a part of the business, right? What leaks back is that we only need maybe like 40 people to support this whole business, kind of, no matter how big it is. Like, maybe we need a lot of like wire monkeys and, like infrastructure people to run the data centers. But even then, like the amount of people that like Facebook and Google and all these guys need to support like all their servers is drastically lower. So you sort of need less people if you're running a SaaS, which means your process can be dramatically different.
yeah. I mean, I don't know if it has to do with SaaS per se. I think it probably has more to do with the way you structure your teams. Like, remember that Steve Yagi email that he meant to send internally to Google, but he accidentally posted
Yeah,
on the
yeah.
internet?
The platform rant.
Right, exactly. And I think I can't really recall. It's been a while, but I think one of his points was that at Amazon, Bezos was very strict about everyone must create a service. And I think that's sort of as opposed to sort of these kind of big monolithic implementations that are you can get very tightly coupled with. Everything must be a
Yeah.
strictly defined service with well-defined APIs. And I think that really lends itself as sort of the natural corollary to two pizza teams, because if you've got that sort of service orientation, to use an old buzzword, you can sort of keep the teams relatively small, I mean smallish, and encapsulated around the implementation of the service, and then have a pretty good decoupling with your collaborators via the service APIs, both
And
the
and
incoming
yeah.
and outgoing ones.
And then if we were to go back to a previous topic, so if you were telling the suits about this, what would you tell them? Like, why you should do this?
Actually, I was telling the suits about this recently. I was up in our headquarters is in Armonk, New York, which is about 30 miles northwest of Manhattan, and I was up there for what's called a technology team meeting, sort of like the most senior technical people at IBM, and we were talking about development practices, and we were talking about sort of geographical distribution, and it was basically just what I said, that it's hard to, but because the thing is, like in a big company like IBM, you'll have on a team, you might have people spread across many time zones and many countries. And if you're actually
Yeah.
doing coding, it's painful, because coding, like if you're doing coding on a component like a shared implementation, it really needs to be a high bandwidth communication between the developers. So if you're fragmented across time zone, it's terrible. So basically, we were saying, with the two pizza team approach, you can basically have smaller teams, and it's easier to sort of geographically defragment a 10-person team versus a 100-person organization. So basically, I think everybody sort of gets that the communication overhead is tremendously great in a development context when you're geographically distributed, especially across time zones. Like, it's bad enough if you're on different sides of Raleigh, but if you're on different sides of the world, the overhead is just tremendous. It's actually really similar to distributed systems. Like, you don't want
Yeah,
to
yeah, yeah, yeah.
you don't want your objects having a WAN between them, but it's okay to have two different services possibly with a WAN between them.
Yeah, yeah. Yeah, no, I mean, it occurs to me that there's a couple of like, well, okay, so there we should have some late that it's the two pizza theory, right? And the two pizza theory is that for like let's call it the enterprise two pizza theory. And the theory is that for any given enterprise grade software problem, it's probable that if you use more of a service oriented way of doing things, you can run it on a two pizza team instead of a globally dispersed team, right? Like, instead of a CMM like mega Uber giant team, right? Like, that you can actually deliver the same requirements and results and everything, if you sort of like do it maybe in a SaaS oriented way, and also like component out people make your architecture be like a platform service oriented thing. Like this is
Yeah.
perfectly phrased, and you know that sounds alluring, right? And then all of the existing people out there who have development teams of hundreds of people, not to mention that the sales engineers and like all the support people are like, you're crazy, right? Like that's not going to work, right? And so it occurs to me that there's a couple of experiments running in public, or I shouldn't say experiments, interesting sources of data we could pull. Like there's this company ServiceNow, which I'm sure you bump up against every now and then, right?
Hmm.
And they're basically a SaaS company, and they're in theory, let's just take it for granted that they're like a pretty good go at having like a service-oriented SaaS thing that's enterprise grade, right? And it would be interesting to see what their sort of like match their employee growth to like revenue and like amount of functionality and see how many pizzas they have to order, if you will, right? Like
Hmm.
in theory, the way they architect things, like if it proved out our enterprise two pizza theory, for any great, given set application and service now, they wouldn't need more than a two pizza team for it, right? Or maybe they do. And there's a couple of other examples of that that are kind of like public, if you will, that you could start to track. Like, do you actually need to be more than a two pizza team for like an enterprise solution, if you will, which I think is far from proven either way.
Yeah, it'd be interesting to talk to the guys who run like the AWS infrastructure or the software infrastructure and see how those kind of infrastructure development teams are structured. I've only ever really done application and service development, so I don't really know about infrastructure.
Yeah, yeah, yeah. And there's another company. They're not public, but another. There's like TaskTop. I'm sure you know those guys, right?
Yeah,
And
McPherson, right?
yeah, yeah, and I think they're probably a little bit bigger than a two pizza team, but they're still pretty small, and they do like really, and I mean this in a good way, but really boring enterprise stuff, right? Like they basically have a bus that does like ETL of all your ALM and PPM tools and all that, right? Like it just synchronizes, they don't put it this way, but like in my snarky way, like their notion is like why break down all the silos when you could just synchronize all the silos, right?
Hmm.
And the problem's not so much that you have silos, it's that the data that gets shared between all of them is crap and manual and doesn't work out well. So you can still use your Clarity PPM tool, your Jira thing for tracking, your like help desk over here, like you can use all that stuff and we'll just synchronize it all and like everything's fine. Which again, there's very few ways you could be more boring and enterprisey than that. And I wonder if I wonder how many pizzas they need, right? Because that's another example of like a valuable enterprise thing that they're doing, and like in theory, that's like a big complicated thing that requires a lot of people. And so it'd be fun to find some examples of like, and like Salesforce would be another one, and like some of the stuff that IBM does, like your team, like how far can you go with just a two-piece team and like SaaS and a service-oriented way of doing stuff?
Yeah, it's hard to say. I mean, I know a lot of the sometimes on our teams they get bigger when we want to support many different platforms. Like I remember on when we were creating the Jazz products, it was like we had to support Windows, Linux, to some
Yeah.
extent Mac, and then Oracle, SQL Server, DB2, MySQL, and then app servers, BEA,
Yep.
WebSphere, and the permutations from the platform support just drove us through the roof. So maybe SaaS does really help because since the implementation isn't part of the customer story, like they don't actually see the deployment, you can choose to have the implementation be extremely homogeneous and
Yeah,
therefore
exactly.
reduce the complexity.
Yeah, yeah, no, and that's why I was choosing like ServiceNow and TaskTop is so ServiceNow is an interesting example of what you're talking about is by nature of running with a SaaS, they as a company don't do a lot of those integrations. Now they have a whole constellation of system integrators who come in and do that dirty work, so to speak,
Mhm.
for you, right? So that might be a cheat, if,
Right.
if you will, right? And I'm sure other SaaSes like Salesforce and people have a similar thing. There's like a constellation of SIs who come in and do all of that for you instead of it coming from the vendor like IBM might do for you. But then I chose TaskTop because they do all of that work, right? So they do all the integrating and working together of making stuff fit together across all these different things they support. And I don't know, like that, and because constantly, that's the thing that you come across again and again when you try to simplify a process. Going back to the topic is like, well, but this is very complicated. Right? Like
Right.
there's a lot of moving parts, and we've got to customize it. And for each account, like they want to use this version of like, these guys want to use Informix as their database, and these people want to use SQL Server, and these people don't care what you use. So you've got to work with all this stuff, and like that's just complicated. So
Yeah.
that's why we need lots of people, and that's why we have to charge lots of money, and that's why it sucks.
What was that Fred Brooks phrase about necessary complexity versus accidental complexity? Like, I wonder how much of this is accidental complexity, just because people weren't willing to, make it simpler, make choices to make it simpler.
Yeah, yeah. No, I think that feeds into a lot of it. Well, do you have any other topics you want to go over, Bill?
Plenty of topics, but probably none to cover in 9 minutes.
I I think I think miraculously we had one piece of follow-up from our last episode
Oh,
that I'm
really?
now looking up, and oh no, it was just a suggestion, but it was from it was from Dave Johnson. Remember who
Oh,
who did
yeah.
Roller and other things, and he was just
TJ.
yeah, he was just suggesting when it comes to like the architect role that this guy Simon Brown has some interesting things to say. So
Yeah,
there's
I
some
followed him
some
on Twitter, but I haven't looked at or I haven't seen any of his tweets yet.
yeah. But so that's the one follow-up that we have. But other than that, now that we're at the end of the show, so we finally set up all of the crazy infrastructure, in a slight haze of enterprisiness. Like if you go to underdevelopment.io, that works. And the podcast feed is now in iTunes, so if you search in there, you can subscribe to it. So you should do that. I mean, why would you want to have to manually go get this stuff? Just
Right.
simplify your life by subscribing. And, we got all that junk set up.
Actually, I got some interesting follow-up from my team. A couple of my team had listened to the podcast, and they didn't actually realize how much I learned from them on a day-to-day basis. So I guess either I have to do more podcasts where I talk about that, or I have to say it more directly back to them. But I guess that would be something for younger developers. Like share your new ideas with the older curmudgeonly people, and even if they don't acknowledge it, you're probably helping them learn and keep current.
Yeah, yeah. No, that's true. That's good advice for life, right? Is never assume that people know that you're thankful.
Yeah, yeah, really.
I think that generally applies in everything, right? It is that's a lesson, that I'm always trying to remember is like, in real life, as it were, you can never apologize too much, and you should also tell people that you're thankful as much as possible. Like probably most people around you don't think you do enough of those two things. So it's always, and if you're trying to collaborate on your team, that works as well. You don't want to apologize too much because that gets annoying in a professional context after a while. But telling people you're thankful is good.
All right. Well, that's
And
pretty
with
good.
that, hey, thanks everyone for listening. We'll see everyone in a week or two when we do a new recording. And remember, just subscribe to the podcast. And if you want to reach me, I'm at Cote in Twitter. And what are you, Bill?
At Bill Higgins.
And you've got billhiggins.us and all that nonsense as well, right?
Yep.
Yep. All right. Well, we'll see everyone next time.